it's hard to imagine that this, what you're describing, is real at this point, and that our Treasury Department basically sanctions it.
Yeah. It was an agreement that the MOU was entered into in 2013. It was seen as an olive branch to continue to open to China, right, with the expectation or hope that China would end up understanding that a capitalist-based society and a society based upon the rule of law, not the rule by law, and fee simple property ownership and basic human rights, which is what every democracy tries to achieve, will show them that economic prosperity is good for the people of China. And in the end, you know what their government has done. They've gone the other way. They've become even more authoritarian. Xi Jinping holds all 5 aspects of dictatorship firmly in his hands today. And the Chinese people have the internet firewall, the great firewall, where they can't see out, but and we can't see in. China's walls are intended to keep the people in and keep them uneducated as to what's happening around the world. We thought, and we hoped, we made a bet back, we'll go all the way back to when Kissinger decided to pivot to China to counter Russia's influence in the region. And then in 2002, we allowed them to ascend to the WTO before, let's just say, without being properly qualified, just like we did with the IMF SDR basket, where they promised to show us the composition of their reserves within 2 years. That didn't happen. Typically, to be in the IMF SDR basket, you also need a freely tradable currency. That didn't happen. So every single promise they've made along the way, they've broken. And yet here we are, continuing to open our doors and afford them important battlefield asymmetries that we've got to turn down. We have to stop the madness, Jan. And it's everywhere. It's in social media. It's in financial markets. It's everywhere we do with them. Everywhere we engage with them, we've afforded them, let's say, the benefit of the doubt and an asymmetric advantage over us, in hopes we could teach them and their people that it is a good idea. And, the most extreme example of this is if you look at the GDPs of South Korea and North Korea, I think you see what I'm talking about. So I think it was a good bet back then. It's no longer a good bet.
Just how much money is invested in these VIEs, out of curiosity? And is there any hope of ever seeing that money, or does it just exist on paper? This is what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, and here's why it's hard to tell. If you look at Alibaba, for example, trading where it trades now, around $85, $90, somewhere in there, it has a market cap because of the number of shares outstanding and the price, but all of that market cap was not paid in capital. Right? It just traded at a level and people started buying it. When we think about the amount of capital that has flown into China from the various inclusions in the indices, the MSCI indices, and let's say the Bloomberg Lehman Brothers aggregate bond indices, we think that there's at least $2.5 trillion US invested into China writ large, including VIEs and ADRs domestically. And that's only a guess. There is no one's capacity to actually tell you exactly what it is, but it's real money, right? It is a huge amount of capital.
And I guess the other question is, a number of people have basically said that the only thing that's really keeping, the Chinese economy alive or, functioning is these influxes of capital from mainly the United States, but the West writ large. How do you view that?
Yeah, and if you saw 2023, it was the first year of net capital outflows from China. And you've seen a number of states, a number of endowments, a number of pensions say, we're just not going to invest anymore in China. In fact, some, like the state of Texas, just recently banned investment into China with state funds. A couple of other states have done so. So you're seeing a reversal there, Jan. And I think what your audience also needs to understand is when you talk about foreign direct investment, FDI is also investment into property, plant, and equipment into companies into China. I know many companies that are U.S. companies that have had billions of dollars in earnings sitting in Chinese banks, and they can't get it out. They can't. The Chinese won't allow it to be wired out. So they hire consultants here and they try to keep it there. Here's a fun fact. Any U.S. company that has net profitability in China and that leaves their money there over those profits, if they remain in bank accounts in China, China automatically accounts that as additional foreign direct investment. So when you see FDI, if you see FDI go negative, that means it's really negative because these companies aren't doing that voluntarily, if you follow me.
So the foreign direct investment is really plummeted, and I've been watching that as well. But there's other ways that money is getting in there still, isn't there?
Yeah. So FDI is actually, let's just say that's excluding portfolio flows. And like you were saying earlier, through the MSCI, the inclusion in the Morgan Stanley global indices and the big bond index, the Bloomberg Lehman Brothers Aggregate Bond Index, through those two things alone, the way you think about those are passive pipelines of blood that grow the tumor. And those pipelines continue to be open today. And those are almost forced investments. And, we fought long and hard against the government's own pension plan, including China, in its investment scheme, which is just insane that our war fighters and our congressional folks were actually using some of their earnings to grow the Chinese military industrial complex. I mean, it's stranger than fiction.
There's reports that Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng, he's been, basically speaking with a lot of Wall Street people, American Wall Street people, prior to the Trump administration coming in on January 20th. There's a lot of money, Chinese money in DC, and there's a lot of interest in keeping those flows going and not having tariffs that are too hard, at least from what I'm hearing. What do you think?
I mean, again, it comes down to what are the intentions of the Chinese Communist Party? Why did they continue to push into and bring militaristic belligerents to the Second Thomas Shoal in the Philippines? Why are our war fighters working day and night with war games against China from a kinetic perspective? And yet on Wall Street, we're considering maybe investing more into our adversary. There's a schism between the intelligence community, our government, and our war fighters, understanding the practical reality of Xi Jinping, his speeches and his actions, and then Wall Streeters who can't wait to make another dime investing into China. Now, mind you, the dimes they're making are not performance dimes. They're getting fees on the capital that's moving in there. And so I would say that the people, I had a conversation with one of Wall Street's largest investors in China, one of the titans of investment. And he said, we were doing a roundtable discussion with the Secretary of State. And he said, well, I think our hawkish stance is unwarranted. We're listening to the hardliners. We need to be listening to the reformers in China. If we listen to the reformers, they really want to reform. They're just having trouble with the Communist Party hardliners. So we need to meet them halfway. And I looked at him and I said, that's interesting. So we should allow them to steal like 150 billion of IP each year instead of 300. Should we let them just put 500,000 Uyghurs in concentration camps? Exactly how do we meet someone who doesn't share any of our value system? How do we meet them halfway? And he got up from the table and he left. He hadn't even eaten his salad. He doesn't want to have the conversation. The people that are throwing this money over there can't have a dialectic about this situation because the facts are too difficult to ignore. You can have a Chinese propagandist tell you, oh, we're growing, we're the world's second largest economy, you can't ignore us. We certainly can, especially if their malign intentions are so acute that it could take us to the brink of a kinetic conflict, which I fear is where we are today.
Well, and all this is also in the context of increasing what we call transnational repression, where we have, anybody that's connected with Uyghurs remotely in the U.S. or the Falun Gong practitioners or Hong Kongers. We have a Hong Konger that has a massive bounty on her head here in D.C., for example. And these actions are actually escalating. Like there doesn't seem to be sort of an attempt to placate on this side as much as there's this huge outreach towards Wall Street.
Yeah, and it's not just towards Wall Street. It's really towards everyone. We have allowed and allowed. Imagine if we had an army of lobbyists and influencers in with the Chinese Communist Party leadership, what we could achieve. They just don't allow it. And so it's important to think about every single asymmetry we afford them. And again, I was in a room with around the time of Jackson Hole with some of the Fed's top folks and the top economists in our country. And I said, before I get started, I was giving a speech. I said, before I get started, I would just love to see a show of hands of anyone in here who has read any time in the last 5 years the Director of National Intelligence's threat assessment report to Congress. Not one hand went up, not one. So there's a huge disconnect between Wall Street, Washington, and the Chinese Communist Party.
You've been an advocate of decoupling from China. And it seems like Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party has been actually, in a sense, decoupling as well, but basically on its own terms. Right now, the connectivities between the Chinese economy and the US economy are huge. And of course, huge amount of imports still coming through. How would this decoupling actually look? And the impact, the argument is that the impact could be very negative on the US consumer at a time when inflation is very high.
Would it be economically difficult? Yes. We import, call it 600 billion from China. Our total imports in the US are about 3.2 trillion, about 600 billion come from China. Our economy's about 30 trillion. Is it the end of the world if we have to find alternate supply chain deliveries from China? It's not the end of the world. Will it be difficult? Yes. Are there certain vulnerabilities that we have in that decoupling? Absolutely. 95% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the APIs for all antibiotics in the US are made in China. We've allowed that frog to boil over time, and now we're in a very vulnerable situation. Many of the rare earth metals are, as you know, about 98% of them are processed in China. And we saw the Chinese move on our additional chip restrictions by banning a couple of the most important rare earth metals for us. So yes, is it going to be difficult? Of course it is. But if you have an adversary that is marching down the road to war, you better figure it out quickly. And so is it difficult? Yes. Is it going to happen? Let's just say organically. If China attacks Taiwan, all bets are off. Jan, how long have we had to have corporate America realize that they need to move a large portion of their supply chains out of China? Probably since 2017, and certainly since 2020. So we've had a pretty long road to, at least we've had a lead time to move out. For the people that haven't moved out, that might end up, losing a lot more or having a much more difficult time. I'm sorry, because the writing has been on the Great Wall since 2017. If you've been listening, reading the Xi Jinping speeches, so I think that is something that's vital and worth focusing on, worth talking about.
Let's say most people that I've spoken with, kind of an enthusiastic supporter of the Wall Street engagement that's been happening. Scott Bessant, you've been a huge supporter of his, in fact, for him getting the nomination, which he has now. So what can we expect might be different from the past when it comes to Treasury in your mind?
I think money does, you mentioned this earlier, money does a lot of talking in DC. And when you look at Scott Bessant, one thing you realize is he doesn't need any more money. He doesn't need to go raise money from the Chinese or the Saudis or anyone afterwards. He is a pragmatist. He understands the plumbing of global capital flows better than anyone that was in the running by far. And he also has a gravitas amongst global central bankers that is important. He doesn't have to earn it. He already has it. So when he steps in there on January 20th or January 21st, he already has the world kind of mapped out and figured out. And so when you say, how is this going to change? We are not going to be taken advantage of the way we had been taken advantage of in the past. We are going to use Scott, I believe, will end up using the tip of the spear of our economic power, and we're going to start acting like we are the world's number one economic power. We also need to know, if you've listened to his growth plans, you realize we're not going to be able to bring the national debt number down. We're just going to have to grow the denominator. We're going to have to get to 3 to 4% growth. We're going to have to get below 3% inflation, and we're going to really energize our economy by unlocking those kind of capitalistic animal spirits that we're going to unlock because of the prior administration's just lockdown on many of these ideas in the interest of climate change and God knows what else, and anti-competition. So I think when you think about this Treasury versus whether it's Yellen's Treasury or Mnuchin's Treasury, I would bet all my money on this one and forget about the other two. Because Scott is as talented as anyone has ever been in the position that he's in.
This Trump administration is inheriting, an accelerating debt, right? And, the debt payments becoming like an increasingly significant portion of the actual, money that's out there. That's one side. The other side is, we have this Chinese economy, per what you've been saying, that's about to implode, that's kind of insinuated itself into kind of everything, the U.S. economy for sure, but also all sorts of places, right? So the question is, this seems to be an incredibly volatile situation that this administration is inheriting. How do you view that?
Yeah, I agree. I think when you look at the time continuum of the United States and where we've had our best years in economic terms and financial terms, you have to go back to what makes this situation so unpredictable and so difficult to deal with is prior to 2009, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet in the United States had never hit $1 trillion. So think about this. 15 years ago, we had never broken $1 trillion in Fed balance sheet creation. From 2009 to 2019, call it the financial crisis, up until the Wuhan virus propagating itself around the world, in a very small window, 15 years, we took the Fed's balance sheet from below one, all the way to $9 trillion. We created $8 trillion of Fed balance sheet in 15 years. And the majority of it was created, $5 trillion was created in a less than a 24-month period between 2020 and 2022. So we have huge imbalances. They went berserk. They clearly overcooked it. Thank God Joe Manchin is alive, or we'd have another $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion thrown into this. So you have a scenario, Jan, where the macro forces acting on us and the rest of the world, we just blew it. We just pushed 40 to 50% dollar inflation to the world, and the world has a negative convexity to our push, meaning what we push them is only the beginning of what happens to them. So if you look at the Middle Eastern economies surrounding, let's just say, Israel today, if you're not a monarchy, you have hyperinflated your currency. It's just gone, including Turkey. And if you look at the South American countries that struggle with populism, we just push the same inflation to them, because the way the world works is everything's priced in dollars. So if we create dollar-based inflation, that inflation affects the whole world. And you look at Japan. Japan's 10-year bond is still at 0.1%. You know why? They can't move it. So we push the inflation to them, and what happens? Their currency depreciates 50. That's the relief valve. So it's vital. It's desperately, we must focus on the Fed's balance sheet, capital money creation, and the deficits. And I think there is a focus in this new Trump administration through Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy on Doge, through Scott Bessent at the Treasury. There is a focus on fiscal rectitude as much as we can do on the cost cutting. So we have a cost cutting crew and we have a growth crew, and both of them need to be very successful. And I'm very enthusiastic about that.
So Kyle, you painted a picture here of, basically a very fraught situation that kind of requires that the U.S. be successful. Where do you see kind of the biggest challenges that need to be overcome here, or the key areas which need to be addressed in order to achieve this? Domestically,
I think the roadmap that the Trump administration has starting January 20th is exactly what's needed. I agree with the roadmap wholeheartedly, and Scott Bessent's vision of how the Treasury will act, and Elon Musk's vision on cost cutting. Boy, I think all of those things together create such a beautiful menagerie of growth and also fat cutting. We need to be leaner, meaner, and we need to show our true economic potential. And I think with those people in charge, along with President Trump, I think we're gonna be able to achieve that. The challenges that are global are the inflation we just pushed to the world is very destabilizing from a geopolitical perspective. We several countries around the world that are vital to their regions hyperinflated their currencies away to where now they're struggling with just operating on a day-to-day basis. It's a real problem. China's economic collapse is a problem where they were a positive force on global GDP growth. We know that they're having an economic collapse. Look at the Chinese bond market today. The Chinese 10-year is comfortably below 2%, around 1.75%, and the Chinese 30-year is below 2%. Think about that. Think about what the Chinese bond market is telling you that the Chinese Communist Party won't tell you, telling you that China's in a recession. So that's a enormous, let's just say, speed bump in the call it parlance of global economic growth, GDP growth, and what the U.S. has to do to overcome that growth. But remember, it is vital to remember one thing: people vote with their feet and their money. The U.S. is 4% of the world's population. We are 25% of global GDP, and we are 46% of global capital markets. So we are the economic superpower of the world. And when the rest of the world falters and fumbles, some of those people will buy Bitcoin, which is why you see it above 106,000, because they can't stand U.S. governance and values and everything that we've got going for us here. And the rest of them will keep investing, I think, in U.S. dollar denominated assets. We still have the most innovative population of any population in the world. We have the best education system in the world, and we have the greatest rule of law and I think human rights perspective of almost anywhere in the world. So we kind of have it all going for us, Jan. And I think that we need to remind ourselves that we are in the position that we're in, and we need to do our best to move forward despite these global situations. And you ask what the problems are. There's a ground war in Europe between Russia and Ukraine that I don't see an off-ramp for. I mean, if we think we're just going to draw some arbitrary line and sign another Munich agreement, you and I both know how that will turn out. Israel, Iran, and Iran's proxies, there's no real off-ramp for that war at all. I think that is going to rage. And again, it's going to rage because we've had these built-up animosities over time and long periods of prosperity have allowed both sides to, I guess, build armaments. And now you have a scenario where Iran and its proxies have the gloves off. And I don't see that stopping. And invariably, in the next few years, during this administration, most likely, you're going to see China take Taiwan. And how do we react there? So those are enormous geopolitical stumbling blocks to a beautiful growth story.
Well, and I want to mention, these values, of freedom, democracy, and so forth, probably the best opportunity for America to enshrine these and kind of live by example.
Yes, I agree.
Oh, well, Kyle Bass, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
It's great to be here, Jan.
Thank you all for joining Kyle Bass and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.